Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the IMF's response and outlook to the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you all for joining us from your homes today, and especially thank you to our speakers who are joining us as well. I'll turn it over to them shortly, so just a few brief housekeeping notes for me to get started. I know Mr. Okamoto has a busy day and a meeting scheduled at 10 o'clock that will start promptly, so we will be mindful of that. Another note on format, we will reserve some time at the end for audience Q&A. So if you do have questions, I encourage you to send them in. You can type them into the questions pane that is located in the control panel, which is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Send those in at any time. I will collect those, and then I'll facilitate the audience Q&A at the end, time permitting. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers, and then I'll turn it over to them to get started. We're delighted to have with us today Mr. Geoffrey Okamoto, who was recently appointed First Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund back in March. It's been a busy couple of months for Geoffrey, an interesting few months. And prior to joining the fund, he was with the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he was Acting Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Development and also Acting Undersecretary of International Affairs. He also has held prominent professional roles in both chambers of the U.S. Congress, in the Senate and in the House. We also have with us Mr. John Lipsky, who was First Deputy Managing Director of the IMF from 2006 to 2011. He's now at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and he wears many other hats, among them a member of our very own Bretton Woods Committee. So I will turn it over to John and Geoffrey to get us started today.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Thanks for the introduction. And Geoffrey, welcome to the Bretton Woods Committee. And thank you very much for taking time in what I'm sure is a crazy busy schedule. And from your home, as is everyone. This is an unusual time. And I assure you, in my time at the IMF, we never considered the possibility that you even could operate the IMF with everybody from home. So welcome to you. I have a number of topics I think will be of interest that we'll pursue, and eventually we'll get to your questions and answers, or your questions for Geoffrey. Before we start, any particular introductory remarks you'd like to make? Feel free.
No, I mean, I think it's great to be here this morning. Thanks for everybody who's dialed into our little webinar here, and happy to get to how the fund is working from home, which I'm sure, like many of you, you're also at home trying to run your day. So this should be a good discussion this morning.
Great. Well, thanks. And I'm sure Geoffrey can imagine what it's like to be in the real office of the First Deputy Managing Director, but for now, we're in that office. It's at his apartment. Now, Geoffrey, to start, not that much time has passed in calendar time, but in terms of economic developments, this has been astonishingly difficult and important time. The IMF, with their economic counselor Gita Gopinath, unveiled the World Economic Outlook forecast not that long ago, but it was put together for sure a couple months ago, and contained, I think, to many observers, a relatively optimistic view about how quickly the global economy was going to start recovering, even though it was quite cautious, I would say. But not pessimistic, but cautious about the growth prospects through the next year. But so let me ask Geoffrey, if the fund has been rethinking or likely to be shading that forecast in one way or another, in the context that my judgment is that, or impression, is that consensus views on the global outlook are probably more downbeat than they were just a couple months ago. So how's it look to you and your colleagues?
Yeah, no, good question, and obviously something that's top of mind and we're asked frequently about is how do we think about the world today? and it changes every day. Just to kind of back up, so you know how these reports are formulated. There's a long lead time, and our team was working round the clock, basically 24 hours a day in the couple weeks leading up to its release, trying to update our models and update our projections, and I think we're not just trying to do it top down. We're also trying to analyze it country by country basis, and to do that for the entire membership is a very involved process. With that being said, the outlook is just as uncertain or more uncertain than it was even a month or two ago, and so much of that depends on where we are at on a day-to-day basis with the health side of things. So unlike other projections where the IMF's own internal expertise knew a lot about trade or financial markets or banking stability, we're having to rely on new expertise that we're now talking with and bringing in terms of epidemiology and public health and the rest. And because the path of the virus is such an uncertain, windy, twisty-turvy path in terms of infection rates and what containment measures are effective, and if there's a vaccine or a therapeutic at some point, our own projections are also quite volatile. But I think, as you said, the outlook continues to kind of become a little bit more dire, or at least a little bit more downbeat. Part of that is as we assess and look around the world and see how countries are, what their experience looks like when they're reopening or restarting their economies. I think what we're all learning is where you're sitting right now in your own neighborhood is that's taking a lot longer than we had kind of expected at the beginning. So that also means the support measures are in place longer. It also means economic activity is foregone for a longer period of time, and as a result, we're looking at the worst recession since the Great Depression at this point. So
yeah, it's tough, and to be frank, you sort of worry that when you hear discussions about reopening, that you don't get the sense that there's such a systematic consideration of cost benefit. We're going to have to, until there's a vaccine or there's herd immunity, I guess we're going to have to live with this virus in one way or another, and going to have to be able to judge in a rational, systematic, and sensible way the strategy for reopening that produces let's call it a maximizing social welfare of balancing the economic costs and the health risks. Can the fund be of help in that?
I think we can, and part of that is collaboration between institutions and even within governments between various line ministries, right? So, we're obviously engaging public health experts in universities and in the WHO and in other areas, and part of that is an input to us, right, in terms of what their expertise is saying about where we're headed and what that means. And what we're also trying to do is feed what we know and understand, right, our expertise over to them, so that can be something useful. It's unfortunately, right, national governments are not built to shoulder the entire burden of their economies for long periods of time. So, and the longer you do it, the more distortive it becomes. The more, we talk about economic scarring in terms of the effects of the economy shutting down. There's also a scarring effect that is, higher up. If the whole system becomes more indebted, it's going to take longer, right, to work off those debt loads and return to a place where you're at a run rate that you were just looking at in January.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that theme. Just one remark. I've been, for one, very impressed and on the same time heartened. There are a lot of very talented economists working very hard to try to provide some kind of a systematic welfare maximizing approach to this issue of reopening. But I'll bet your colleagues in research and elsewhere are in touch with this research. But let's turn to the fund's own anti-crisis action. Let me give just a tiny perspective. Back in the great financial crisis, the IMF had concluded in August 2007 that the crisis was on. 2007. Remember, in January 2008, the MD spoke out in Davos saying that we needed a 2% of GDP fiscal stimulus, excuse me, in the advanced economies. And in March of 2008, I gave a speech saying, which I entitled "Think the Unthinkable," that we were going to require fiscal support for financial systems. Yet the action wasn't really galvanized until the collapse of Lehman in September 2008, a year later. Here, the action has been dramatic. The reaction has been both faster and larger, and the fund has been very aggressive in addressing the problems, even without substantial new financial resources. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the fund's view about its role, what it's trying to do, the innovations you're working with, and basically how's it all going?
Yeah, well, we're quite busy, as you can imagine. I mean, I think part of what we're trying to identify at the front end is where the liquidity problems are that we can arrest sooner rather than later, right? And avoid then kind of a sliding towards insolvency when the financial need from us and others, right, becomes much higher. So to that end, working fast has been a priority, and that hasn't been easy, as you can probably imagine. And this is a good thing. The fund is a very deliberate, thoughtful, purposeful entity, right? And we're dealing now with a pace and throughput that is quite extraordinary. So just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with, we have over 100 countries that have approached us for emergency facilities, and that's an unprecedented pipeline, right? For us to be looking at, that's 100 separate conversations with national governments. That's 100 separate internal review processes that are going on to make sure there's policy alignment and even-handedness across programs. That's 100 different financial transactions on the back end to try and facilitate the transfer of resources. And you think about what all that means is we've had to work quite fast, but we're working at record speed to date. So just until to date, I believe we've approved over 60 of those 100 programs. Our board is meeting every day for several hours a day, including today, considering these requests. Those 60 countries to date total about $18 billion in emergency assistance. We've also tried to revamp our toolkit. And so one thing I looked at when I came in was where do we have gaps in the toolkit? One of those was the need for a new instrument that we now call the short-term liquidity line, or SLL. This we had being in the fortunate position of having a lot of work being done on this exact topic several years ago. Unfortunately, it didn't come to fruition then, but one sign of good international multilateral cooperation was we were quickly able to approach our board of governors and get the authority to put that instrument in place. It's now in place, and we're looking to see which countries could be the first users of that instrument. We're also increasing our concessional funding for our most vulnerable countries. To that end, we have a fundraising objective of trying to hit $17 billion, or basically the resources that would then flow up to $17 billion in new resources for our poorest countries, and we're close to meeting that goal. So we thank all the governments that have been contributors so far, and those that want to contribute. I'm happy to hop on the phone and have that discussion. You've also heard that we've been instrumental in orchestrating this G20 debt moratorium on official bilateral credits. This is absolutely critical because it's going to effectively provide some debt service relief to our poorest members. And over the next 6 months, there'll be a stock taking that happens later this year, and it's possible that could be extended further out. Alongside that, as a way for us to participate in our own way in that respect, we're We work with donors to fundraise $1.4 billion. That's our objective for 2 years of debt service owed back to the IMF. So we're trying to create the fiscal space for governments to be able to react promptly to the virus and its both its health and its economic effects. And as Kristalina likes to say, spend what you have to, but keep the receipts. So there's accountability on the back end. So as you can imagine, there's more in there, but those are kind of the high points.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's unpack this a little bit in a bit more detail. Of those 100 applications, are basically most of them or all of them for RFI or RCF funds? In other words, these rapid, non-conditional, no ex post conditionality, but limited in scope in terms of funding. Is that been the bulk, or are there also for actual programs? And we'll come to some of the other stuff a little later.
Yeah, those in my total there, I'm counting emergency program requests. So these are programs that are fast dispersing. There's no ex post conditionality that attaches. Because of what we're dealing with here, we work with our board to double the access limits for those. So that our kind of rough math is that there's about $100 billion available for countries that we think could use it. But alongside that, you have programs that are obviously coming forward for reviews that we're continuing to process. We have countries that we're in negotiations for other upper credit tranche programs that are in train. So there's this isn't the only work stream that's active, but I think is the one that's closest to our liquidity arresting kind of effort as it relates to coronavirus.
Exactly. Now, these are all the RCF rapid financing instruments. They are, although the initial, the first year access was doubled from 50 to 100. If I'm correct, the overall limit is still 145% of quota, I believe. And so is it the expectation of you and your colleagues that it's quite likely in the current, given your forecast, that these countries will eventually be coming to the fund for a more conventional conditional program, a standby arrangement, or even an EFF?
Yeah, and this is I'm going through the effort right now, just in terms of work planning for the organization and where we're gonna need to be 6 or 9 months or a year from now. And that's a critical question in that, right? Is how many of these programs that we were able to put together quickly and disperse transition into ones that require a full-fledged program negotiation, right? And ongoing monitoring and review, and probably capacity development and technical, to bring all that, coordination with other MDBs. And the answer is we don't really know yet exactly how many that will be. In my view, it will be a good chunk. We'll probably be coming back, and for some, this conversation is going to begin rather quickly. And I think as it relates to the moratorium, one thing that we're going to have to do in the middle of this is, the world started out with a much higher debt level, and in many of the countries that are approaching us, the debt picture looks quite uncertain, right? It's possible under one pandemic scenario that it's serviceable. There are some where it's serviceable, but barely or on a knife edge, and then there's other ones that are that don't look like they'll quite make it. But because of that amount of uncertainty, the debt moratorium helps us buy a little time to get clarity in that picture, and also for the fund and the bank's staff to complete updated debt sustainability analyses on these countries, so that we know we're going in with an informed view when it comes to a longer run program.
So the RFI and the RCF obviously are a big success in the way that they were intended, and that they're providing relatively rapid access to medium-term finance, but at least in this emergency, they're obviously being sought after. And the other innovation, big innovation, is this calling for the debt standstill, which is never been done before, and of course was echoed. Was endorsed by the G20 and echoed by the IIF, the Institute for International Finance, for private sector lenders. Now, there are a couple of questions. First, let's just talk about, as far as it goes, the funds, for the funds on debt and for official multilateral and bilateral lenders. How's it going in terms of the negotiation of actual debt moratorium for the low-income borrowers?
So we have a term sheet with G20, and we're this idea may have come from the World Bank and the IMF, but it's it's in the G20 official creditors' hands in terms of the making it work, and we're there with them, in active conversation on how to further that. But there's a term sheet. It describes what types of credits and what types of entities and what types of countries are eligible, and the rules for that. Where the G20 asked us to do is participate where we can, and there's two ways that or really three ways that we're doing that. One is the one I talked about, which is we're fundraising the grant resources that are needed to basically cover the debt service owed to the fund, so that's one. Two is the World Bank and the IMF are providing net new flows, positive flows to these countries at a time when those are quite scarce for these countries. And three, we're going to be involved in kind of the monitoring of the effectiveness of the moratorium itself. In other words, to help the G20 come to an informed view on whether to extend this or recalibrate it or the like. And so we're going to be active in all three buckets there over the next several months.
Well, that's great, and I take it that's a hopeful expression that this is actually going to work. Never been done before, but that it is going to work. Now, the other part that's absolutely unprecedented is the Institute for International Finance call for a similar service moratorium from private sector lenders from its members to low-income countries. Are you in close contact with them in terms of working this out? And I understand this one turns out to be extremely complicated given the inherent complication of a variety of private sector contracts.
That's right, a variety of contracts, a variety of institutions, many of whom don't know each other, right? I mean, it's not like the creditor group for country X gets together once a month and talks about how it's going. So this is obviously an extraordinary challenge for, in other words, it's beyond just 20 countries in a room negotiating it. It's a much more dispersed, complicated issue. Obviously, we're in very close contact with the IMF at all levels. In fact, I believe our team is meeting with the IMF today again on some of these issues, and we're hopeful that we're able to find a way to make that work alongside what we have done in the official creditor space. As you know, over the last 10 years, there's been a shift in the kind of debt composition or financing composition of countries away from the traditional official creditors and into new emergent creditors and also private sector credits and local capital markets and the rest, and that's made that's been good in some respects because it has allowed some governments to tap capital very efficiently for productive projects, but it also makes it a bit more challenging to put all those pieces together for a purpose like this.
Oh yes. Well, and not to be indelicate, there's one of the big changes over, let's say, between the global financial crisis and today, is that the largest lender to the low-income countries has become China, or Chinese-based institutions or official institutions. And in the past, they're not members of the Paris Club. They've been an observer now, but heretofore their attitude has been that they are not particularly transparent about terms of lending, and they have not participated in a pari passu way with other official lenders when they're come to debt rescheduling. The G20 ministerial, as I think a lot of folks noted, called for both transparency and pari passu terms, and we all noticed that, and we know that China agreed to that wording. So I think there are a lot of folks interested whether the largest lender, the largest creditor to these countries, is now going to be participating in a much more collaborative and cooperative way than has been the case in the past, rather than treating it as a strictly bilateral basis, bilateral issue. Do you have any insights into that issue?
Yeah, I mean, a decent amount. And this is obviously complicated, not just for the borrowing countries and for us, but it's also, I think, quite complicated for China to work. I mean, this is the first time they're having to deal with some of these questions, certainly at this scale, but also just within their own system of institutions. So we have an ongoing dialogue with China on how they are thinking through these issues and how they plan to address them. As you noted, the positive thing here, right, which I think when we started was not, at least for me, I wasn't really sure how it would work out, but getting the Paris Club and newer creditors, right, and China and others, quite frankly, and so non-Paris Club participants, non-Paris Club creditors and Paris Club creditors to agree on the same way to proceed on this was actually I mean, that's to me one of the biggest signs of broader international cooperation beyond your traditional G7 or your traditional creditor club. And that's because I think there's a recognition that there's more interface with various creditors and borrowers that goes broader than the traditional set is what is exactly needed to get at this issue. And the fund, I think we were proud as the fund and with obviously with the World Bank to help facilitate a productive outcome there. But the devil's obviously in the details. We're in the early stages of this. Several countries have requested the moratorium and so that's being worked through. There are several countries that are considering it, and so we're in discussions with them as well, and we'll continue to discuss with the G20 how that's going and where we see the challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just detour slightly. Geoffrey, when you were at Treasury, I believe you had some contact with the G20 process. Is that right? So back when I can say I was present at the creation, and I would say that on the one hand, the leaders process hasn't produced big results. Just look at the leaders' statement on COVID-19, and it's pretty devoid of much content other than nice words. The ministerial communique was a different beast entirely. And for my money, the leaders process is one thing, that's political, which can be extremely powerful when it represents a consensus. But the ministerial process, and especially the deputies process, which is an ongoing encounter between these countries, and it's like a repeated game. It seemed to me that what it did was it produced a regular, detailed, let's call it fact-based or a substantive contact on fundamental economic and financial issues. And after a while, you can't just go to those and stonewall. So that tends to produce real dialogue. Now, I haven't been at one of those for a few years. Is that working out that way? And is that one of the reasons you've been able to make progress on things like this debt moratorium?
Yeah, I think first of all, it starts with the tone by ministers, right? So and the tone by ministers was very clear. I think the Saudis were very instrumental in dealing with. I was at the last G20 ministerial that we had in person, which was in February in Riyadh. And that was just as this was coming onto our radar. As you'll know, the G20 communique at that time made reference to the virus and what we were going to look to do. But because I think you saw this kind of from that stage, right? The engagement between then and April, when we had our virtual G20 ministerial. There was a lot of focus of the mind on this issue, and to me, this is when the G20 is the most effective. When you're focused and there's a clear deliverable and a clear objective, that focuses the negotiators or the representatives around the table. I shouldn't call them negotiators because negotiating a communique, but that's not really why you're there. I mean, you're there, that's the output at the end of the day. What you're there is to solve problems. And so when you have these 20 representatives plus the international institutions and some observers in a room, it's not only a good conversation in the room, but then you have very candid and clear conversations bilaterally at the margins, and can make progress on G20 issues or your own bilateral issues. It continues to be a good forum, and I think the Saudis, I mean, had an incredible task to hold the first virtual G20 finance ministerial, and it went very well. I mean, not only technologically it went well, but the deliverables were actually, I mean, solid coming out of the meeting in April. And so, as we kind of go along, I think our objective is to work with the Saudis and our G20 members to make sure that the focused agenda translates into clear guidance on what they see us doing and playing a role in, and where they see other institutions.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask it this way. So today you read the newspapers and it's dominated by static multilateral relations at the leaders level. But you're striking a note that sounds much more upbeat and much more hopeful in terms of, let's call it international collaboration through existing channels, established channels at the working level. And let me take that one step further. And if so, if that's right, how would you describe the fund's role, and are you happy with the role the fund is playing in that process?
Yeah, no, I think, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Nothing ends up perfect, and these conversations are on some issues quite difficult, right? And you can kind of go through the years of your various G20 presidencies and kind of mark out the issues that become stickier or that are more divisive and the rest. But I think right now, and I can only speak for the finance track because it's the one obviously it's most relevant to the fund's work. But that's been quite clear. I mean, in terms of the position and the guidance and the action plans and the rest are very clear and focused. We're glad to be participating in all of these discussions. There's a lot of coordination between not only the IMF and the G20 presidency, but also just kind of across the rest of the multilateral framework, which I don't have the history in terms of IMF World Bank and IMF Inter-American Development Bank and IMF name your other institution. But right now, this coordination is very close knit, Kristalina and I are talking to our World Bank counterparts several times a week on everything from what do we do about our physical buildings in Washington D.C. to the program design of Name Your Country, right, and how that's going to fit together. And so that kind of coordination is happening at all levels and is very good. So if there's a silver lining to all of this, right, that has taught that has not only forced the institutions to work hand in hand with each other, but I think we're seeing how that's useful, right? I mean, that's feeding through, we think, into better program design and policy response, and we want to continue that even after the crisis abates.
That'll be good. The G20 leaders have been calling for closer coordination with the MDBs since the first meeting, and maybe it's actually going to happen this time. Let me come back to a little bit more specific to the fund again for a bit. One thing that I think has caught the fund observers' eye is the flexible credit line, which is when it was created was rather unique. A large-scale, no quota, no a priori quota limit in terms of access, and no ex post conditionality. It was used initially only by 3 countries: Mexico, Colombia, and Poland. Used early on in the global financial crisis, and especially in the case of Mexico, to great effect. Now we see the fund is supporting an FCL for Peru. At least the press reports say Chile is hoping for one. Does this mean the FCL is going to be more active? When it was initially approved, we heard a lot of language at the board that it was a platinum card facility, and which meant hardly anybody could use it. Is it look more usable to you these days?
I think, one thing at least I try to think through is the high standards that attach to the FCL are useful in a sense that they it's because of the way it's designed, right? Because of how the instrument is designed, it's a protection on the fund zone, the use of the fund zone resources, right? So that's an appropriate safeguard in terms of if there's no conditionality attached, you would need to have, right, the highest quality policy framework in place, and for us to trust it for that to work. It's also useful for capital markets, so right, and so the countries that have signed up for these FCLs are active in capital markets, and the markets themselves see that good housekeeping seal of approval from the IMF that attaches to an FCL as useful. And from the fund zone perspective, we want our actions to be to sweep in, right, the participation of other financiers and creditors, right? And so to the extent that these instruments improve the confidence of markets in various economies and governments, that's useful for us. Obviously, they're not there just to be something on the wall either. So if there were to become a time when there would be a need to draw on it, we would hope that countries would do what they needed to do in the moment to draw on it. Going back to my earlier conversation on liquidity versus insolvency and the balance there, having a country avoid a very clear need and avoid using it, right, and then needing a much bigger draw, right, 3 or 6 months later is not something that we would find to be a good path to be on. So if for those that have FCLs, we're obviously in close contact with those governments on how they're assessing conditions in their economy right now. And I think if they were to approach us and say that they were to need a draw, I mean, there's a reason why these are fully provisioned against our resources, and that's because if they are needed, we have the resources ready to go to be able to disperse.
Thanks. That's very, very interesting remark. Now, let's two more rather specific questions. Your innovation, or one of the big innovations, is the creation of a new facility, the short-term liquidity line. On the one hand, as I've been saying for a long time, people think the fund has responsibilities not only in crisis resolution, but crisis prevention. But in my mind, there has not to date been a facility or an instrument of the fund that was meaningful for crisis prevention in a world of securitized finance when you need insurance-like or swap-like facilities. So even the FCL and all the other so-called liquidity or emergency facilities of the fund provide rapid access to medium-term credits. The SLL is a real liquidity line. It's a swap-like facility. But of course, the question is, given the standards of access that look similar to an FCL, are you happy with the instrument as it's designed, and do you think it's going to be used?
We think so. I mean, I think we're not trying to rest on our laurels here and getting an instrument in place, but then nobody uses it. So there's an active conversation that we're having with several members about the SLL and what they could use it for in terms of the challenges they currently face. There's also a window in which the SLL doesn't become as useful, right? So part of this is judged on the basis of these instruments are most useful if they're put in place soon for a select group of countries. We have a pretty good understanding of the universe of countries that we think would qualify for this, and it's not everybody, but it's several, right? I mean, it would be useful to a good chunk of the membership that we at least in my view, and those discussions are ongoing. There's also kind of a longer term strategy in terms of the toolkit, the SLL, I thought it was quite important to put this in place. And one is, as we look at a world where we're thankful and grateful for the Fed to install additional swap lines with a broader set of central banks, and obviously there's going to be some need to transition when countries potentially from other types of swap lines to instruments that we have. There's also a way for us to think about how we think about FCLs and the longer run usage of those, and whether it's possible that once a country improves its reserve position or what have, or the kind of recurrent pressure that they may see kind of fades, that they could instead utilize an SLL as a result. So.
Well, thank you. I think that sounds very promising. In other words, the fund is thinking hard about how to use both its existing facilities and perhaps change or improve those to be able to play a much more useful crisis prevention role, and to see how that fits into the international system, because right now we have kind of an awkward system of as I put it, there's a tiering of central banks. The first class are the big guys who have their permanent unlimited swap lines. There's the favored friends of the Fed, that's the business class, who may or may not get the swap lines from the Fed, and then everybody else is left to the IMF. Hopefully there will be some good thinking about in a systemic way, and the fund can be useful in that context. But now that's all sounds very promising. Let's turn to fund resources. Got enough? And if not, can you get more?
A question we're asked quite frequently, and at the moment, we've done kind of our assessments, even in light of the current economic projections, and judge our resource envelope to be sufficient. So our lending capacity at the moment stands at about $1 trillion. That's that's split between quota and new arrangements to borrow, or NAB resources, and then there's bilateral borrowing arrangements, which can be activated beyond that to supplement the other two. We're obviously quite thankful that governments are moving quickly to ratify the doubling of the new arrangements to borrow. So that's a critical thing, and we're thankful to the U.S. and others that moved earlier in the year on that. And I know the Bretton Woods Committee was helpful in kind of making the case for us as an institution and on the merits of that proposal. But obviously this is something that we're going to continue to evaluate over time. There's as we think through what the economy holds in front of us, we'll think about what our resource envelope needs, and I think we also have to be careful about overlending too. I mean, I think there's a when we make a loan, it's debt like any other debt, and so there's a we can think about a business or a household or a country. Debt makes sense in a lot of matters or a lot of cases, and there's some extreme cases where additional debt doesn't make any sense, and so we have to be careful that we're also being judicious in our own lending, and we have debt sustainability frameworks and access limits and the rest to kind of guide or not guide, but govern kind of our process on how to do that. But we have to keep that in mind as well.
Yep. Well, that brings to mind a specific large borrower from the fund. I don't know if you can say anything or want to say anything about how things are going with Argentina.
Yeah, I think there's obviously we're in close contact with Argentine authorities, and also in discussions with the membership on this, and some of the creditors have also approached us. I think just like any other member, Argentina is facing a very difficult situation. It was difficult before the coronavirus kind of swept through, and now that it's hit, right, has hit Argentina particularly hard. I think they're obviously doing what they can just internally to stabilize from the virus's effects, and simultaneously trying to engage in a very complex negotiation with creditors I think we think it is essential that that Argentina's unsustainable debt is addressed. I think we're not a party to the negotiations between Argentina and their creditors, so I can't really comment on the goings on between those two parties, but certainly we're encouraging both to work constructively together, and we hope to see some conclusion of that puts Argentina and creditors in a mutually beneficial arrangement.
Yeah. Can I take that in more broadly? That the fund's traditional role with regards to cases that may require restructuring or renegotiation is adequate. That the fund can play a constructive role without making any changes in how it goes about its business.
I think we have policies in place on how to engage in those negotiations and discussions. I think there's the next year, right? Year and a half is going to be pretty pivotal for how those work. And so one thing we're doing right now is taking stock of our existing policies and procedures and the rest to see if we're ready for the months that lie ahead. And part of it is are we set up for how the world is currently organized, just in terms of creditor groups and types of credits and countries, but also a throughput problem, right? So there's again this issue of throughput where we won't be negotiating, or we won't be in conversations with countries that are in debt negotiations that are one by one. It's very possible there are several at the same time, and that will provide a challenge that's unique, not just for us, but that will be a challenge for creditors, many of whom are exposed to several countries that may be in that situation.
Great, thank you. I see time's starting to run short. Let me ask a couple very pointed questions, narrow questions. Obviously, there's been a lot of hue and cry internationally about the desirability or lack of desirability for a new SDR allocation. I don't know if the fund has a view. And then secondly, one of the things the G20 did was to push back the target date for the next quota review to the end of 2023. For those of us who were around, that date was originally supposed to be October 2014. But SDR allocations and quota, any commentary?
Yeah, and SDRs, there's our membership is split on that. So we obviously see merit in a general SDR allocation. Our membership is still discussing that. I think one thing that we're doing is looking at the root of what they're asking us to achieve, which is quick liquidity to countries, and this is whether that's a general SDR allocation or one thing I'm working quite hard on is how do you mobilize the existing stock of SDRs in a way that's more efficient for some of the members that have acute liquidity needs. So that work is ongoing, where we're trying to work fast, because like everything else, faster in this environment means that you're more useful. But obviously the discussion on a general SDR allocation will continue, and we'll continue to engage with our membership on that. On your other question was on sorry.
The quota deadline getting pushed.
Sorry, quota deadline. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, so I think we just wrapped up. We just closed the last quota review. I think there's some discussion, right, among some of our board that we should start thinking about the next quota review. These things obviously take some time to develop. I think we also want to make sure we go into that quota review with an informed view of what we're dealing with. So to that end, I think the next few months or several months is going to paint a pretty clear picture of where the fund sits in terms of its financial, what's needed of its financial resources, but also in terms of where it sits in the broader fabric, and that will be instrumental in articulating a vision for the quota review.
And we know that this next one's going to have some big implications in terms of ordering of who's up and who's down. At any rate, finally, I know you've been you've mentioned it already, but I want to give you a chance in case you want to say anything more about this issue. That there's no question that maybe even particularly the advanced economies are going to come out of this one way or another with absolutely unprecedented amounts of debt. Any broad comments on what the fund thinks about it, thinks it can do? Obviously highlighted in the fiscal monitor and the work of the Fiscal Affairs Department, but how do you foresee both that problem working out and the fund's role in it?
Yeah, obviously, I don't think we're second guessing many government's decisions to need to pursue additional fiscal spend right now. So to that end, we're tracking, and there's heightened surveillance that we're placing on these kinds of issues, but we're, at the moment, we're not second guessing countries' decisions to do that. What I think is going to be the first kind of thing we'll need to assess, and this is going to be difficult for governments, is how do you remove policy support? There will be political pressure to keep these financial supports in place for longer than they're needed. These are difficult to unwind and will create new challenges as you unwind them. But leaving them in place is also distortive, and also it's expensive, right? And there's a limit as to how much of this financial support governments can afford. So I think we'll look at that question and then try to get that right first, because I think that'll be difficult on its own. And then obviously the surveillance action the surveillance activity will continue on its own track.
Final substantive question before we turn to audience questions. The fund had been pursuing some new initiatives or new concerns: inequality, gender issues, climate issues, environmental issues. Obviously, for everybody, those have been muted by the current emergency. Is the fund going to come back to those questions over time?
Yeah, I think we've obviously had to prioritize our work given the current workload and staffing constraints. And in the middle of all this, if you can think about it, all of fund staff are currently working from home. So if you think about the challenge that creates, we're doing an unprecedented amount of work, and everybody's at home. In fact, my first day was actually at home on the job. So this is a unique challenge, and what that's meant is we've had to prioritize a good amount. There is an eye towards how do you when you reopen or when you rebuild after this, how you bring those themes in focus, and so that hasn't, all of that work hasn't fully stopped. I think it's been, depending on what the issue is and its relevance to a current policy discussion, it's given more or less attention relative to coronavirus emergency response. But certainly I would expect those themes to be featured in the work that us and other institutions are doing down the line, and with the eye towards making progress in the post-coronavirus world. So
great, thanks. Emily, are there some questions? Is there a question from the audience you want to that looks good to pose?
Yeah, I know, Geoffrey, that you have to move on here, so maybe just one quick question from the audience. We have had a lot of questions about Argentina, about SDR, but I think you've addressed those. So this question comes from Bill Rhodes, and maybe you can just quickly address whether there's plans to extend the debt moratorium for the poorer countries after the end of the year.
Good question, and thanks, Bill, wherever you are. And yeah, I think one aspect of this is going to be one thing that we're having to do right now is evaluate kind of the effectiveness of the debt moratorium, including how freed funds are utilized and where countries sit 6 months from now. There is a G20 meeting scheduled for later in the year, and I believe that'll be a point when we'll have to kind of provide an assessment and on where things are at. And I think there is a good amount of interest to extend it beyond. That'll have to be a decision of G20 of the G20 to do that. But certainly we're here to provide the analytical and operational support to make an informed decision there. On our own, if you can read anything into it, on our own desire to provide debt service relief to the IMF, we want to extend that out for 2 years, right? So we want a full 2 years of relief, and we're actively fundraising to meet that objective.
And that fundraising you said earlier is going well. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been able to make the allocations needed to match the G20 through the end of the year. We're fundraising now beyond that, and so we'll continue to kind of keep pushing out our own date for that, but we're not quite there yet. And again, if anybody's from a national government and wants to talk, we're happy to have a dialogue and see what can be done.
Well, thank you so much, Geoffrey. Yeah, I think we've run out of time.
Well, okay. I think we ought to give Geoffrey the opportunity. Final words. You've been at the fund not yet 2 months, and yet it's been one of the most amazing periods for the fund. Any first impressions or final words before we end this session?
Yeah, no, thanks. My baseline's a little different because, as I said, I've been working from where you see me right now for day in and day out for the past few months since I started. But one, you don't have to be in the office to know that the IMF has excellent people working for it. And these folks are not only homeschooling their kids right now, but they're doing missions to countries in Asia or all over the world in the middle of the night. And working pretty hard on the demands that we're placing on them to deliver the program. So one, I recognized is this is an incredible institution and has great people working there. And two, the fund has been built for crises like this. So we're having to retool some things internally to make it work well for this particular crisis. But this is being able to see the fund at its best. Is something that's been quite rewarding, although it's been busy and demanding at the same time. And so with that in mind, I think we have an eye towards when we can begin to normalize things again. And John, I have been to the office. It's been remodeled, I believe, since you were last there. And I think there may even be a different desk. You can go in and carve your name on it. We'll let you in at some point. You can carve a message, but I do think one thing that hasn't moved is the Japanese 4 or 5 panel art piece that I believe I think Stanley Fisher put on the wall initially. So I don't know if he's watching, but that's still in the office. So I think about that every time. One thing when I walk into the office on the rare occasion that I do and see that on the wall, I think about the great people that have preceded me in this position, and of which you're one of them, and the high standard that is required of the management team at the IMF to deliver. And so with that, thanks very much to the Bretton Woods Committee for organizing this morning's event and for all the support you give to us as an institution. And I look forward to engaging with all of you in the future.
I can't thank you enough for taking time out of this schedule to share your views with us. We appreciate it, and we wish you and the managing director and all your colleagues all the success in the world, and at this very, very crucial moment. We know you're playing a very critical role, and so far so good in a very demanding and concerning and difficult time. So it's absolutely true. You've got, as you've discovered, a fantastic and wonderful staff, very dedicated, very talented. There's no other group like them. And welcome to the fund. Thank you for your time, and give them our best, and best of luck to you. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.